When people hear the word migration, it automatically brings up a lot of feelings.
14 dead and more than a dozen wounded.
More reports on what appears to be a horrific night in Paris.
Police identifying the killers as a husband and wife, both Muslims.
They think about migration from a security perspective.
Dozen people to plan and execute an attack of this magnitude.
Posed as a refugee using this passport.
They think about migration from a political perspective.
Has become the new political issue.
The border is a little bit easier to radicalize than an American growing up in a New Jersey high school.
They think about migration from an economic perspective.
Jobs have gone to immigrants.
The department is just dropping them in places like Minneapolis.
But as believers, it's really important for us to also think about migration from a biblical perspective.
Desperate refugees braving a life or death journey across international waters.
Asking that all Muslims go home.
The U.S. now saying refugees are not welcome.
All through Scripture, what we find is that migration is part of the biblical story. And it's a major theme in Scripture from the beginning to the end. And God uses migration to bring the nations to Himself. And through migration, the gospel is going out to the nations. In New York City, you have people coming as refugees. You have people coming for career reasons. We have tens of thousands of international business people there. We have 25 to 30,000 workers at the United Nations from all the different nations. 60 to 70,000 international students coming from all different nations. But now, migration is happening in such a powerful way that New York City is no longer unique. We're seeing major ethnic enclaves of people popping up in cities all over the United States.
About 6 years ago, I was driving in Burnsville, Minnesota, which is the third largest community of Somalis in Minnesota. And I rear-ended a man named Muhammad and hit him like 5 miles an hour, you know. But he gets out holding his neck and he calls an ambulance and they come and they take him away, and I end up getting papers a few weeks later, getting sued. I remember thinking to myself, you should just go back to Africa, mister. And but that was like the moment God got a hold of me and said, this is not the heart I want you to have. I started praying for Muhammad, and I found that the prayer changed my heart. God really changed my heart. Where before I might have crossed the street to avoid a Somali, now I cross the street to engage.
I became a believer right before college, and you know, my idea of missions was probably the same as most people. It's you get on a plane and you cross a body of water and you go into another country. And I had never thought about missions as far as reaching those people who come to us. But now, with the great migration happening in the world, people are starting to realize that reaching people who God has sent to us is actually a very strategic ministry, and we need to take advantage of this.
One of the first families we invited over for dinner, the husband, he stops right in the middle of dinner and he says, today is a very historic day for our family. And I'm thinking, well, something spectacular happened back in Somalia. And he says, well, we've lived in America for 14 years, and today is the very first day we've ever been invited into an American's home.
When you interact with the community, it's almost like you're taking a step into Somalia. Everything is part of the culture, the clothing, the food. It's really, in a sense, a cross-cultural experience just being in Minneapolis and walking amongst the Somali population. We really need people who are willing to enter in.
It's interesting in Deuteronomy 10, it says, God defends the cause of the fatherless and widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love the foreigner residing among you because you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. God has a heart for those who are vulnerable in our midst.
Here we are in LA, where there are roughly 1 million Iranians who have migrated to California since the early 80s. And when you look at a neighborhood like this, you wouldn't think of immigration, but the Iranians have become successful. They've accomplished the American dream. They've assimilated into the American culture. So in many ways, it's very easy to build relationships and share the love of Christ with this people group. Iran is a country that's officially closed to Christian workers. It's actually illegal to share the good news of Christ. Less than 1% of the population in Iran are believers. This is a place that disciples of Christ would love to go and share the hope of Christ. And while we can't get in, God in His sovereignty is moving hundreds and hundreds of thousands out and bringing them right to us.
It says in Psalm 107 that some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and the Lord delivered them from their distress. They were in a position of migration, their lives were ebbing away, and what did they do? They cried out to the Lord, and the Lord heard them. This is exactly what we see happening in the world today, that God is using migration to cause people to become spiritually receptive so that they're ready to receive the Lord.
So my mom, she cleaned my plate in front of everybody and tell everybody I have to clean this dish in a special way because it's dirty, it's unclean, because my son, he's a Christian. So for 15 years I pray for my mom, and guess what happened? The Lord miraculously worked in her life. She knelt down, eyes filled with the tear. She said, I accept Christ as the only Savior. You have to show the love of Christ to everybody. It doesn't matter, Persian or Chinese, Japanese, whatever, whoever. You are called to love the people because He loves you first.
Loving the foreigner is not something we're called to do only if it agrees with our political position. Loving the foreigner is something we're called to do as people of God because we're followers of Christ. The very reason that God says again and again in Scripture to love the foreigner among you is because the people then, just like the people now, had their own personal reasons why they felt justified in rejecting them. And while God is not ignorant to those reasons, He calls the people of God over and over again to love the foreigner. God is calling us to love the foreigner in ways that they can feel it. If God's heart is to call the nations to Himself and He tells us to love the foreigner among us, then the way that the nations will see Christ is when they actually experience the love of Christ through us.